Okay, action. We are live on LinkedIn Live, and this is part of my sort of LinkedIn Live series for the Global Wellness Breathe Initiative, where we just share conversations about the power of breath with thought leaders in this space. And I'm so happy to have this conversation today with Patrick McKeown, who is the founder of Oxygen Advantage and a best-selling author of The Breathing Cure, Oxygen Advantage, and now has a new book out called Breathing for Yoga, which you co-authored with Anastasis, how do you say?
Tanzi.
Anastasis.
Yes.
Tanzi. And we are also joined by Tiger Bai, who is the founder of an online yoga studio called Better Yoga, and she is also a certified Oxygen Advantage or Master Oxygen Advantage teacher. And I too am an Oxygen Advantage teacher. I don't teach, but I went and took the certification to get a deeper dive. And Patrick, you have been, as you know, such a mentor and educator to me, because while I've been practicing breath and yoga for over 30 years, I never knew how or why the breath worked. I just knew that I needed it and it worked. And I sort of went with that. So it's been fascinating reading your books and getting to know you over the past several years. And Tiger, I'm so excited to have you join the conversation too, because I also got my yoga teacher training certificate way back in 1995, also just as a deeper dive for the practice that I began in 1989. And it's so important breath is an important part of yoga, but it really wasn't taught, or the only way that it was talked about when I started yoga way back then was, inhale on an expansive move and exhale as you were leaning in or relaxing a little bit more. That was about it. The term deep breath was used a lot, and we want to talk about that today. But I would love to just start with you, Patrick, and talk about, I know, first of all, that you work with so many different sectors of people, business people, elite athletes, people with asthma, people with chronic COVID symptoms and all of that. And now you're working with a whole new niche of people, which is people who do yoga. So tell us a little bit about Breathing for Yoga book and why you decided to sort of do something at the intersection of breath and yoga.
Thanks, Sandy. I think it was just really because yoga instructors have an enormous capability of getting breathing out there and getting breathing out there in a way that can make a big difference to people. And I felt it wasn't happening. So even though yoga instructors are actually teaching breathing, I'm not sure if the yoga instructor really understands the background to what they are teaching, because they're teaching something based on tradition. And also what was confusing was the whole idea, the emphasis on taking the full deep breath. Where did that come out of? Like, I couldn't figure out what's the benefits of that. And there's a risk of taking the full deep breath that it causes one to hyperventilate. And that in turn is causing blood vessels to narrow and reducing oxygen delivery throughout the body. And I'm sure if
we lost Patrick. I'm sure he'll come back. But
I can definitely relate to what Patrick was saying until he returns. There's a lot of flippant cueing. If you go to any yoga class, I'm here in the United States, and yoga is just another kind of exercise these days. People go there to do cardio and to gain strength, which is a wonderful thing. These are not bad things. But when the breath is an afterthought, it's such a missed opportunity, because really it's the foundation of all physical exercise, of all life in general. So I agree with Patrick. There's a lot of confusion around, when to cue breathing, what breathing to cue, and what even a deep breath means. Anatomically, deep is a direction in the body from superficial to deep. And so, when you cue that term, take a deep breath, you'll see a variety of movements one might take depending on how functional their breathing is. It certainly cues a very loud loud breath, and you get a lot of this recruitment of accessory muscles here in the head, neck, and upper back and shoulders. And so I think Patrick's right. Like, where does this come from? Why would I be doing this? What's the point? And if anybody is like me, I need to know the why behind the what I'm doing. This would be a very pitta prakriti. If you're familiar with Ayurveda, very pitta tendency to have to figure things out, to have to know why. And, you know, when I first got my 200-hour certification, I was trained by some wonderful people, but we spent very minimal time talking about pranayama, let alone breathing chemistry or biomechanics. And, you know, I think most people, when they conceptualize yoga in the West, they're thinking of asana, they're thinking of physical postures. And indeed, in the 8-limb path of yoga, pranayama comes after asana. But really, we do asana as a preparatory act for the breathing. It sets up the container. And so it's a very important aspect of yoga, but really just a slice of the pie.
Mm-hmm. I love that. And I've heard you say somewhere online that it's not only important to really be mindful about your breath while you're on your yoga mat, but you know, it's the other 23 hours of the day that's really important also. And that was sort of my aha moment with my yoga experience, was when I took the power of breath off my yoga mat and brought it into my life as an entrepreneur, or later my life as a parent, and just being able to influence my nervous system by changing the way that I breathed. And so I think that that's also an important point, that it's almost like, you know, these yoga classes are like a luxury. Welcome back, Patrick. Thank you.
Thanks very much. So much for having a power outage, huh? That's good
Oh
time.
my goodness. That's okay. We're good.
Another opportunity to breathe.
Absolutely.
Another opportunity to stay calm.
Exactly. So we were talking about how taking the breath off the yoga mat is so important. And for me, I used to only look at my yoga class as an opportunity to not only calm my nervous system, but also sometimes balance it or boost it. And it became sort of a luxury, because I had that at that time. Classes were like 90 minutes, yoga classes. And so it was like, it did feel like a luxury. But now what I love so much about the power of breath is that just, you know, all you need is the 10 seconds to do the light, slow, deep, nourishing breath, and you can transition. So it's wonderful to do the yoga. And I think that's a great place to learn to connect the body, the movement, the breath, and then understand it. Like you talked about, Tiger, understanding the physiology, the biochemistry of it, and then taking it into real life in accessible little digestible bites. So Patrick, will you talk a little bit about dysfunctional breathing and why sometimes people have no idea that they have dysfunctional breath? And then also, since you said in the beginning, one of the reasons that you're focusing on the yoga community now is because it is ginormous. It's very big. I mean, I live in LA and there are yoga studios now on every single corner, but it's also very common in just across the states and everywhere around the world. So I do think that a lot was left on the table in yoga and yoga class. If you are going to devote an hour now to a practice, why not understand what's happening and how to make it even more impactful for your mind and body with breath?
Oh, I think totally, Sandy. A lot of students going to yoga are going to go there for mental health issues. And many of those can have dysfunctional breathing, suboptimal breathing, because our breathing is very much influenced by stress and trauma that we encounter in our daily lives, in our normal lives. And we can develop the habit of breathing a little bit too fast and too hard in upper chest. And with females, for example, maybe 60% of people who attend yoga could be female. That's only a guess. I might be incorrect there.
75.
75. And hormones are going to play a role there in breathing. So because of the monthly phases. So a female who, for example, is post-ovulation going through mid-luteal phase, and she's experiencing an increase in progesterone, which is a respiratory stimulant. Her breathing now is faster and harder. She's more prone to fatigue. She's more prone to anxiety and panic disorder, which affects 2 to 3 times more females than men. She may also be struggling during some of the asanas. You know, there's a time for the female to go easy, and there's a time for the female to push herself. And like, on the few times that I don't know yoga very much, you know, I contributed the breathing part of it. A yoga instructor contributed the yoga part. And I also asked Magdalena Crawler, who just did a PhD thesis on yoga breath. And she went through the entire book, and she wrote 2,000 or 3,000 words that's in the appendix, bringing everything together. So when I did go to the yoga classes that I went to, which I enjoyed, I seen students struggling. And those students shouldn't have been struggling. Those students were disproportionately breathless. And the yoga instructor was cueing a time that everybody was to follow this time in terms of breathing, whether it was breathing in for 4 seconds and out for 6, or in for 5 or out for 5. But all students were following a time. But the ones who were struggling would find that very, very difficult. And the other thing is, I couldn't help but notice that I could hear people breathing inside in the yoga studio. What was the purpose of that? Or why breathe in through your nose and out through your mouth? What's the purpose of that? Whereas the yoga instructor who's fully versed in breathing, from understanding and recognizing the signs of dysfunctional breathing, and understanding and recognizing how to interweave good breathing practice into yoga, which is very, very easy. Like, in breathing, there's only 3 dimensions. You've got the biochemical dimension, the biomechanical dimension, and the psychophysiological dimension. And a good yoga instructor can interweave an entire breathing class throughout the yoga and target those people with panic disorder and anxiety and asthma and poor sleep and disproportionate breathlessness, and improve blood flow to the brain, improve oxygen delivery to the brain, help bring a calmness to the mind. And this is where I see the potential in yoga. It hasn't been tapped. And I also see that yoga classes aren't just going to be a class for yoga. That same instructor, they're going to have a class for yoga, but they're also going to have a class for breathing. It's the same studio, and it's the same students. You know, and this is really where we want to go. We want to bring breathing out of the tradition. Tradition has held breathing back. And here's the other thing. Tradition would have been okay if it kept according to a tradition, because the original yogi masters understood about breathing, and they understood about the importance of light breathing and subtle breathing and in and out through the nose. And the breathing that we hear nowadays in many modern yoga studios, that only originated in 1880. So that was primarily in Europe as a result of the hygienic movement. People were dying with tuberculosis, which affects the lungs. And an idea took root that if you took these full deep breaths, that it prevented germs from spreading throughout the body. And of course, India at that time was under the control of the British Empire. And it's likely that the idea went from Europe to India via the British Empire. So it actually changed yoga breathing in India, which is kind of bizarre to think that you have a system in India that has been taught for, whether it's 10,000 years or 5,000 years or 2,000 years, nobody really knows the exact origins of yoga. But it's around a long time. Now, and then there was an American yogi instructor, Walter Atkinson was his name. And of course, he didn't call himself Walter Atkinson, he called himself Yogi Ramacharaka. And he started talking about the importance of taking these full deep breaths. And that's how the idea then was reinforced. But it just doesn't make sense, because it's likely that many people will be hyperventilating in a yoga studio. And that's partly why I think the book was brought out.
So interesting. And Tiger, how have your students, what's the response been since you really do integrate breath for so many different aspects of life? And can you talk a little bit about how you do address, like, if people with panic disorders or people with asthma or dysfunctional breathing, how do you actually integrate that during the yoga class, during a flow or whatever?
Yeah. So I think the number one thing I've noticed, you know, people come to yoga a lot of the time for the mental benefits. Obviously, there's a physical benefit, but a lot of people will associate yoga with being calmer, being more level-headed, being more centered. And yes, all of these things can happen should the breathing practice within the asana practice be supportive of those goals. And so what I see a lot is, of course, over breathing, this very common cue of matching the breath to the movement. Okay, well, if you're doing a sun salute and you're moving quickly, even if you are breathing through your nose, which most people aren't after a certain break-off point, there's a lot of subconscious hyperventilation that happens because they're trying actually to be in the flow with the movement of the breath to the asana. Now, this is a missed opportunity, I think, because really, when you want to match breath to a movement, one, you have to think about what movement am I doing? First of all, am I going into lateral extension and flexion? Am I extending the spine? You know, what is the movement and what breath is going to be supportive of that movement? And then you also have to think about what you're going to be doing after you finish yoga. Most people are going to walk out of the class after Shavasana or during Shavasana and go right back to their super busy life. So if they've just done a series of very quick movements, you know, power yoga, matching breath to movement, and then maybe the teacher throws in some Kapalabhati, breath of fire at the end, and then they go halfway in Shavasana for 2 minutes, and then they leave, and then they get their cup of coffee, and then they're on the road again. It's like the yoga is not calming you down. The yoga is adding to your stress. So that's a part of it, is just recognizing, you know, yoga is a lifestyle, and it's a lifestyle that's supposed to cultivate balance. So if your life is going 100 miles an hour, and so is your yoga practice, the physical yoga practice, it's not going to be very supportive of cultivating that balance. Now, your question about how do you recognize people who might have breathing dysfunction or, you know, respiratory patterns that can be actually a little bit dangerous, something like panic disorder or more chronic hyperventilation. It takes time for an instructor to learn to view their students and really be watching them. So, you know, it's a skill set to be able to instruct and demonstrate while also having another eye out on your students. So I invite people who I train, other yoga teachers who are just getting into understanding the implications of poor respiratory patterns in their students every day. I invite them to spend a class not demonstrating anything. Improve your skills with your language to instruct a class so you can spend more time viewing bodies, starting to understand patterns. Are they breathing and having their whole shoulder girdle lift up? Like, you could take off the shoulder girdle and put it on a mannequin. Like, are they really using and recruiting a lot of accessory breathing muscles, which have such poor leverage on the rib cage and use way too much energy? Or are they protruding the belly really dramatically, trying to get a belly breath, which actually might not be supportive of the proper biochemistry or biomechanics to support an asana, right? So in the oxygen advantage, we talk a lot about the lateral breath, the lowest ribs expanding side to side being a better marker of diaphragmatic recruitment. And we're not just saying that because we hate belly breathing. We're saying that because when you take an anatomically deep and wide breath, that is creating intra-abdominal pressure. It is supportive of the lower spine. There's a huge correlation between people who have low back pain, most prevalent reason people miss work, and upper chest, mouth breathing. Okay, so if you're coming to yoga class and you've just spent all day at your desk, hunched forward, lungs collapsed, mouth breathing, then you come to yoga doing 100 sun salutes, mouth breathing, matching the breath to the movement, and you wonder at the end of the night, oh, I feel so tired, like my life is so exhausting. It's like, well, let's maybe think about how we can use the yoga practice to actually be supportive of the balanced lifestyle that really yoga is aiming to deliver to people.
Wow. Yeah, your students are lucky because you're adding like such a whole new dimension to practice that's so important. And Patrick, I love what you said about the hormones and women and being more physical at different times of the cycle. Dr. Mindy Pelz, who's a intermittent fasting expert, often talks about that too. There's certain, times where it's important for a woman to fast and other times where we shouldn't be fasting. And so I think we all need to, but we don't know. And so this education is really, really important. I would love for you to talk just a minute about your definition of a deep breath and the location, again, just what Tiger was starting to introduce about, starting it down low and then also, incorporating it. So you talk about and maybe demonstrate what is a great deep breath to be integrating during yoga class, but also off the mat. And maybe if you could explain what's happening in the nasal cavity and in the brain and in the lungs when we're, breathing optimally versus dysfunctionally.
Yeah, I think the best demonstrator of a deep breath is the little pup that Tiger has. The pup understands more about breathing than the human being because the pup will be doing it according to nature. So I'm not sure if your pup is close to hand there, Tiger. A deep breath is basically when there's good recruitment of the diaphragm. You don't have to take a full breath. You don't have to be over breathing. So you see with dogs, very often they can have the mouth open. In our instance here, the dog is having the mouth closed. And if you were to look at any animal, you will typically see that the animal will be breathing, gorgeous dog, regular, and will be breathing low. You don't hear the dog breathe. The dog isn't intentionally taking deeper breaths. Like when we take a breath in, there's a signal sent from the brain stem, the medulla. So a very primitive part of the brain. And it's sent via the phrenic nerve to the diaphragm breathing muscle, which is our main breathing muscle. And during rest, the diaphragm breathing muscle moves down by maybe 1 to 2 centimeters, not very much. And the intercostal muscles are the muscles between the ribs they pull out. So as the diaphragm moves downwards and the intercostals pull out, it creates a vacuum in the chest, which in turn will draw air into the lungs. So it's the diaphragm moving downwards that draws air into the lungs. It's not the air coming into the lungs that pushes the diaphragm downwards. Now, as the diaphragm moves downwards, you're going to have some movement to the front, some movement to the sides, and some movement to the back. And Tiger made a good point, belly breathing. People often talk about it. They're pushing and pulling their belly, irrespective of their breathing patterns. So we do want to have movement on all 4 sides. And it's very important because the diaphragm breathing muscle isn't just for respiration, but it provides stabilization for the spine, just as Tiger alluded to. 50% of people with lower back pain have dysfunctional breathing from a biomechanical point of view. 90% of athletes, in a study published in the Journal of Strength and Conditioning Research, and a study looking at Japanese athletes of all ages, of all sports, 1,933 athletes, and concluded that 90% of them have dysfunctional breathing. And there's a link between breathing and movement. So here athletes who are having dysfunctional breathing are going to be more likely to have dysfunctional movement and an increased risk of injury. And, I think we're going to have everyday people going into yoga and they will have dysfunctional breathing. So a deep breath for me simply means you've got good recruitment of the diaphragm. And that's going to be primarily driven by the nose, because when you breathe through the mouth, it's very much an upper chest breath or a shallow breath. Now, your second question in terms of what does the nose do? Well, I suppose the nose does everything in terms of breathing and the mouth does nothing. So now I'm asking my own students, what is in your mouth? Well, your teeth are in your mouth, your tongue is in your mouth, your hard palate, your soft palate, and your throat is in your mouth. Is there anything else in your mouth? No. Do any of those things do anything for breathing? Does your tongue do anything for the breath, or your teeth, or anything? Your hard palate, your soft palate, your throat? No. You don't need to be a doctor. You don't need to be an MD. You don't need to have a PhD to realize that your mouth is simply not for breathing. Your nose is for breathing. Now, of course, people are going to say, well, when I'm doing my physical exercise, I need to open my mouth. There is some point at which, yes, the intensity of physical exercise, especially more moderate to high intensity exercise, that you cannot sustain nasal breathing. But in a yoga class, I think for most people, they should be able to sustain nose breathing throughout a yoga session. And the other aspect that I would say is that breathing should be in silence. So for the yoga instructor to cue 2 simple words, breathe in and out through your nose and breathe in silence. And if you are breathing low and if you're slowing down the breath, don't intentionally breathe more air, because the more air you breathe, it's not true that more oxygen is getting delivered throughout the body. Now, that's based, of course, the Bohr effect, which was discovered back in 1904 by the Danish physiologist Christian Bohr, that there is a role for carbon dioxide. It's not as simple as breathing in oxygen, which is this wonderful gas, and getting rid of as much carbon dioxide as possible, the waste gas. There's a balance. And with human, of course, there's a balance here. And even if you look at traditional yoga, man's life is not measured by his years, but by the number of his breaths. Your breathing should be so smooth that the fine hairs within the nostrils do not move. Your breath was measured in terms of finger widths. If you were breathing very subtly, you just had 1 finger width. If it was a little bit harder, it was 2, maybe 3, maybe 4. It was quite hard. So there was always about conservation of the breath and suspension of the breath, and about breathing light, about breathing subtle. Like I might be worth just reading a couple of sentences out of the book. Yoga Sutra 2.5 further notes that the breath becomes long and subtle. And I think it's a great word, subtle. Because subtle for me, and I haven't yet actually put it into the Oxford Dictionary and see what it means, but the way I would interpret subtle is, it is light. Although this may not be a direct pranayama instruction, this signals to the practitioner that they are on the right track when the breath becomes so stable that it is hardly perceptible. This is the 4th state of pranayama and is later called Kevala Kumbhaka in Hatha Yoga. And a literal translation of the term is pure retention. And there's much more, in terms of despite the unfortunate tendencies to overbreathe in modern pranayama classes, hygienic context did provide helpful hints on how students of yoga should mind their breath in everyday life. And an important feature was given to the importance of nasal breathing over mouth breathing. So in modern yoga, the focus is on slow, steady, and harmonious breathing, as opposed to the rigorous breath retention of the Hatha yogis and of the deep breathing of the hygienists. Deep breathing was influential, and the idea is still deeply rooted in many, but it did not diffuse all ideas and contexts of pranayama. In other words, we were trying to break down the idea in terms of going back into history and using the expertise of Magdalena, because of course when she's after doing a PhD thesis, she's already uncovered a lot of the facts there that we wanted to weave them in. But yeah, I hope that answers, at least in part, some of your questions.
Yeah, so interesting. Go ahead, Tiger.
Yeah, I would just like to echo what Patrick was reading from the Yoga Sutras. The most ancient yogic texts all refer to the fact that the goal of pranayama, yogic breathing, is the gradual cessation of breath, which is that breath holding, the apnea, kumbhaka, either at the bottom or the top of the breath. So, really all of these maybe more involved or technically specific breathing techniques are all in service of getting people closer to that more subtle functional breath. And I'd just like to make a distinction between pranayama, these breathing practices meant to manipulate the flow of prana, of life force in the body, and functional breathing, which is what Patrick and the Oxygen Advantage is really pioneering forward. Functional breathing is everyday breathing, breathing during day, exercise, and sleep. Really, we're talking about a baseline of nasal breathing as best you can, light, slow, and deep, to support, again, the proper balance of the biochemistry, oxygen to carbon dioxide, proper biomechanics, and of course the psychophysiology, the mental calm and choice one gets to make when one is at center. Pranayama is different. Now, it's one thing to go to a yoga class and engage in, like I said, a Kapalabhati practice or a Bhastrika practice. Now, these exercises are not bad or wrong. They all have their time and place. And really, yoga is a part of a greater system of Ayurveda, the science of your life or the truth of your life, translated from Sanskrit. And in Ayurveda, it's very much an emphasis on seasonality. And there's a time and place for every practice. When it's early spring and the ground is full of mud, it's wet, it's cold. Well, practices that heat the body and aerate the lungs and get the flowers up out of that mud, metaphorically, in the body, well, that's a great time to be doing bigger breaths to combat the sluggish energy of early muddy spring. Okay, but in the middle of winter, when it's dry and it's cold and it's windy, adding all of that extra vata, would be the Ayurvedic term for it, that extra air and space, can make people go crazy. There are whole hospital wings in Indian hospitals for people who have overdone it on the pranayama. They're vata deranged, would be what that's called. And so, you know, it's not that pranayama is bad and how your yoga instructor is teaching you to breathe bigger is bad. It's just about understanding the time and place for what breath. When you have a baseline of functional breathing and your breathing is healthy, and then you want to go on top of that and engage in some other pranayamas for a certain energetic effect, that's wonderful. The issue is just simply when somebody has dysfunctional breathing, they're hyperventilating, they're shallow breathing, they're mouth breathing, and then they do these upregulating breaths on top of them, and it overloads them. It stresses the system. It does the exact opposite of what they went to class for. So I just always like to emphasize that seasonality and that time and place being so important in a yoga practice and in a breathing practice.
I love that. Thank you. So I also just want to address our modern lives today. And Patrick, you know, you've been at the forefront and such a leader with with oxygen advantage type and Buteyko type breathing for decades. But now, do you think that the reason so many people are more open to it, maybe more aware about it, is, you know, that we live these modern lives? And I'm always hearing in my corporate work that people feel like they're holding their breath, you know, with stress, checking email all day, or at work, or in back-to-back Zoom meetings, or in-person meetings. And there, you know, so many of us are living in this either holding our breath or this shallow, rapid chest breath, which actually causes the low-grade chronic stress. So will you talk about how we can just, you know, be more mindful during the day, and how also recently, I would love for you to talk about, in a yoga class, somebody was saying that when they changed their breath, I think we were doing a long hold, and then they started breathing and they got dizzy. So would you talk about like what makes someone dizzy when they breathe in a certain way? So I'd like to talk about those two things: modern life, the stress that it's causing on our breath, and then also dizziness and breath retention.
Yeah, and it's coming back to what Tiger was saying. If yoga instructors, and of course, it's never all yoga instructors, but if anybody is teaching yoga, I think it's really important for them to understand what their breathing instruction is actually doing to the body from a scientific point of view, and not just based on tradition. Because then you can tailor a breathing approach to a specific student. I had a student here a few days ago. He came in, his breath hold time was very, very poor. And he said he just felt that he couldn't take a deep breath. And then I was wondering, well, is his breathing problematic from a biomechanical point of view, or is it from a biochemical point of view? So I assessed his breathing using the high-low test in different positions, and his breathing seemed fine from a biomechanical point of view, but he still felt he couldn't take a deep breath. The problem was his breathing from a biochemical point of view.
What's the difference? Will you explain the biomechanical
yes,
difference?
Of course. So the primary driver to breathe is carbon dioxide, and it's not oxygen. And some of us are a little bit more sensitive to the accumulation of carbon dioxide in the blood than others. And if we're overly sensitive to the accumulation of carbon dioxide, our breathing is going to be harder and faster. And with that then, because we have a harder and faster rate, we're likely to feel that we're not getting enough air. And this is likely his instruction that I just feel I can't take a deep breath, because he's feeling air hunger in his normal everyday life. Now, that will normally drive somebody's breathing to the upper chest. But then when I put him into the high-low, assessed it in various different positions, he did have good recruitment there. So you can always tweak it, and this is where just focusing on one dimension of breathing can be problematic, that you need to be exploring it from different dimensions. And a yoga instructor will be able to cue breathing exercises to the needs of the student that's in front of them, and to let some students know that if you feel that the air hunger is too much for you, you need to go at your pace, and to interweave pauses as well throughout various practices. So for example, breathing in gently through the nose and out through the nose and holding the breath and pausing for maybe a count of 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and doing it very gently. And this would be, you know, this could be skillfully interwoven, that the student might even be, they may not even be aware of it, they're just following the cue of the instructor. But the instructor knows where they are bringing the students, and the instructor will also know, well, yes, some students that don't have great breathing, I'm not going to have them do that hold. So there could be a cue there to these instructors, or these students, maybe just hold your breath for 2 seconds, or don't hold your breath at all, just follow your breathing. And to explain to students that the air hunger that you experience, it's not because of a deprivation of oxygen. The air hunger is due to an accumulation of carbon dioxide. And it's really, really good to expose yourself to that, because number one is there's a primal fear of air hunger. We are, as human beings, we have 3 main fears: thirst, food, hunger for food, thirst for water, but hunger for air is the big one. Now, when we put our own students into a controlled dose of air hunger, we're helping to desensitize their reaction towards air hunger, because that's very often a symptom that will arise in anxiety and panic disorder. And very often these individuals who are prone to panic and anxiety disorder, it's the fear of suffocation that terrifies them. So from a psychological point of view, we can desensitize it, but also from a physiological point of view, we can help to normalize their minute volume so that they're not breathing fast and shallow. They're not breathing mouth. They feel comfortable with their breathing. They can sustain a yoga practice without running out of air, because breathing in a yoga practice isn't determined by how you breathe in the yoga practice. This comes to your second question. Breathing in the yoga practice is determined by how you are breathing outside of the yoga practice. And it's true, sitting at a desk all day answering a phone, that's over breathing, and people who are in that situation will relate to how exhausted they feel after a day's talking. And it's not because of the mental concentration. It's because of the effect that the talking, excessive speaking, is having on the breath, that we end up breathing too much air, and this then is contributing to fatigue. So you have that, you have your 100 emails in your inbox that never seems to clear. No matter what you do, it's still always there. And there's no question, modern society is mad. And we are expected to live these calm, outwardly beautiful lives. And then we go on social media and we're thinking, oh my God, my life is terrible, because everybody on Instagram has this wonderful life. They're all out at the beaches. They're all eating these lovely meals. They're having the time of their lives, and my life is absolutely dreadful. And now we have a comparison going on. And we're even comparing ourselves today to how we were yesterday. Like, it's just crazy, the whole thing. And, bringing breath into your own way of life is a tremendous little tool. You always have it there, and you can draw upon. And the one thing you can do with your breath is just even have a normal breath in through your nose and a really slow and relaxed, gentle breath out. Your body is telling your brain that you are safe. And that's all your brain wants. Whereas if, for example, you're reacting to the situation with faster breathing and harder breathing, your brain is automatically interpreting that the body is under threat. And all the brain wants to do in that instance is get you out of the situation. So it's really important in today's mad times is to tune in on your breathing and to tell your brain that you're safe. Because, it's something that I think it's a tremendous little tool. Now, the other thing that I would say to people is you don't necessarily have to take a full breath to allow the slow and relaxed exhalation. You could be in a situation that you feel that you don't want to do a breathing exercise, but the beauty about this is nobody will even see you doing anything. You could have a customer that's giving out in front of you and their mouth is opening and closing. And yes, you're hearing words and there's some noise coming out of their mouth, but you're bringing your attention inwards. You're taking a soft breath in through the nose and a really slow, relaxed, gentle breath out. Or it could be the boss, or it could be a work colleague. So whenever there's a little bit of tension and confrontation, not surrendering our mind to that. And I know it's not always easy, but what's the alternative? Because if we surrender our mind to what's going on there, it's a recipe for angst. I have a few things that I feel that we're so exposed to information. Turn off the news. Honestly, turn it off. Limit the amount of information that you're reading and watching. And some people are fine with it, but some people aren't. And sensitive type of people who are more prone to issues with their breathing and their perfectionist tendencies, they're really better off, limiting their exposure to the negative feed that we're getting. And that's all we seem to do get is negative feed. And be careful what you're letting in, but you do have your breathing there. Instead of spending so much time on your phone and, watching different programs or whatever, give yourself some attention. Your body craves it.
Yeah, I love that. And it's so true. And I even tell people, like, if you are going to be scrolling social media, breathe. Take those light, slow, nourishing breaths while you're doing it. Because just like what you said, you're in a meeting or you're whatever. That's the beauty of breath, is that it can be done inconspicuously in the moment. And it can just, emotionally, it can transform in engagement so that you have time to calm your nervous system. You can respond to something versus react to something. And so I think when people begin to understand the practical, daily, in the moment benefits of breathing mindfully, it's life-changing, it's game-changing, and it's never too late to start. And it's really never too early to start. You can teach a 3-year-old child how to just sort of take agency and breathe better, and so that they can feel a little bit more relaxed, because these young kids now are growing up first and foremost tech-centric. And so if they don't learn how to breathe, the more that you have that dysfunctional breathing, I feel like it's holding you back from feeling good in your body and feeling good in your mind and sleeping. And when the respiratory system isn't optimized, I feel like all the other vital systems are not working as well. So everything comes back to the breath, and it's so experiential that people don't need to necessarily have to understand all of the science behind it in order to walk away with the 1 or 2 or 3 things that you really preach, which is the nasal breathing, the slow, very light, and the breathing, the deep, but from down low. And so I hope that this conversation helps people to want to just experience breathing in a way that we are meant to breathe in, even though it feels counterintuitive to the speed of our lives these days. We'll wrap up. One of my favorite quotes is from Iyengar, the yoga master, and who says that the mind is the king of the senses, but the breath is the king of the mind. And that's just so powerful, because our thoughts are really the greatest source of stress. So if we can use breath, the slow, light, nourishing breath through the nose, as a way to create better thoughts, we can start to manage stress like that. And then, tying it in with yoga makes it just exponentially as powerful. And again, people often, when they meet me at a corporate workshop or something, they assume that I must be the most calm person in the room because I've been breathing so well for so many decades and so long. But that's what I love about breath, is like, I'm not wired to be calm or to find stillness very easily. And so it's always, it's a blessing. And it's like this human superpower that we have these breath tools, because every day is different. You can't master being calm in our modern world, unless you're like living in a monastery or you're a monk somewhere. But I'm not a master of it. I'm a daily student of it. And so I'm grateful to both of you for all of the teachings and helping people, because I feel like, the more that we learn about the how and the why, the easier it is to want to change, because these tools really are simple and life-changing. So if each of you will end with like a little piece of advice of where someone can start. So if someone sees this conversation and it sparks an interest to like, how is my breath? I don't even know if I have good breath or a dysfunctional breath. Just leave with a piece of advice for somebody to be curious and start experimenting and becoming more aware of their breath. And then let us know how people can reach out to you individually.
Sure. Thank you so much for having us, Sandy. I would say, it can be daunting to think about, among all the other things one has going on, adding a 30-minute breathing practice to the beginning or end of their day when, they have so much to do. I would suggest thinking about something you do every day that you can practice your breathing during. Are you walking the dog? Are you making a smoothie? Are you cooking? Whatever that 5 to 10 minute activity is that is daily, use that as a time to consciously slow your breath. Breathe through your nose. It can be as simple as starting that way, because it's not going to be easy at first training your functional breathing if it's dysfunctional. As the great Lauryn Hill says, people work hard to make it look easy. And it's going to be a little bit of work at first, but eventually, the efforts become graceful and the grace comes more easily with an easy breath. So that's what I would say.
So true. And how can people find you?
Yes, you can find me on betteryoga.net. That's my online studio. Practice with me all week. And I have a free breathing class at 7:30 in the mornings on Eastern time on Wednesdays. So you can find me there.
Love that. Thank you. Patrick?
Yeah, I suppose it's for people not to be concerned after this conversation, to be concerned about their breathing. One more thing to do, as Tiger alludes to, but at the same time, I think it would be wonderful for people to understand that two things got me into breathing. One was I was practicing breathing light about 25 years ago, and it was very crude practice. I wasn't doing it right at all, but I got the essence of it. I put one hand on my chest and one hand just above my navel. I started slowing down my breath as Tiger spoke, and I kept on slowing it down to the point that I had a tolerable air hunger. And from doing that with a tolerable air hunger, if I was feeling stressed, I would take a rest and then I would come back to it and just gently soften and slow down my breathing. But I was under breathing. And I was feeling that I would like to take in a deeper breath. And my hands got warmer. And there was a change in the saliva, increased watery saliva in the mouth. Now, that was one exercise that there was a true cause and effect, because I always had cold hands. And that has never left me. And then the other exercise, I've always got a stuffy nose. I have a nose that's all over the place, a deviated septum, one nostril smaller than the other. And the exercise was to gently breathe in, breathe out through my nose, pinch my nose, hold my nose, and just gently nod my head up and down, maybe 10 times, 10 nods, and then to let go and breathe through the nose. And with doing that a few times, with a minute's rest in between each, my nose opened up. Now, that started paving the way. So I would say to people is start experimenting a little with your breath and get to understand how you can influence your breathing to get some changes there. And I think what Tiger said is tremendous. Bring your dog for a walk. Don't be having your mouth open. Your mouth isn't for breathing. Breathe in and out through the nose. You might have to slow down initially a little bit at the start when you're doing your yoga practice. Breathe in and out through your nose and have silent breathing. And you might feel that the air hunger is a little bit stronger. If your air hunger is a bit too strong, just breathe a little bit fuller breaths, but don't switch to mouth breathing or slow down the intensity of the asana. So, this is the stuff that, it's okay to feel air hunger, because when you're feeling that air hunger, you're exposing yourself to an increased carbon dioxide in the blood, which is helping to desensitize your reaction to it. So it's actually very positive. So we do have to train our breathing patterns. And I would even go beyond what what you spoke about as well, Sandy. The brain, by regulating breathing, controls its own excitability. We can directly influence blood flow and oxygen delivery to the brain. We can. And our brain consumes 20% of our oxygen. It's 2% of our body weight, but it consumes 20% of our oxygen, and we can influence that. So if anybody wants to improve oxygen delivery to their brain, don't be going around taking full big breaths, and especially not through your mouth.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's such a human superpower. And the one thing, it feels counterintuitive to want to play around with air hunger. Like when I first really learned from you about, so when you take a breath, and if you retain your breath, like in some of the yoga breath practices, like box breathing, you're retaining it on both an exhale and an inhale. And sometimes that feels scary to people. Like you yourself has had asthma in the past, or for people with panic disorder, the breath retention, even for a couple of seconds, can feel scary. And so it feels counterintuitive. Why would I want to induce that air hunger? But I think it is really important to understand that breath retention, that air hunger that you feel, again, it's not that you need oxygen. That's the buildup of the carbon dioxide. And so you're building up in a tolerance for that, which helps everything. And I think that what I found is people just didn't understand that. And all they focused on was the immediate air hunger and like, oh, I need, but you don't need. So knowing is sort of that security blanket. I don't need the oxygen. What's happening now is that carbon dioxide is building up, and that's okay. And that's how I think then you can begin to be more comfortable with the slower, lighter breathing, because you realize you're getting enough oxygen. It's fine. And that's where I think that's important to understand.
Actually, you're getting more. Yeah, good point. You know, especially if somebody is prone to panic disorder, dip your toe into the water very, very gently with it. And if you're just doing light breathing, you might start off doing it for just 15 seconds or so. But I think that brings it full circle as well, Sandy, because we were talking about, or Tiger was as well, yogi masters and an experienced student in yoga, that it's almost that their breathing disappears into nothing. Mm-hmm. But in order for that to be the case, you have to have a reduced chemosensitivity to carbon dioxide. So what we're deliberately doing is we're deliberately breathing a little bit less air to increase carbon dioxide in the lungs and blood, to desensitize and to improve the tolerance of CO2. So we're really on track with what was the original aim. Mm-hmm. In terms of some forms of breathing practice in yoga. So it's not that we're putting out anything that's new. There's nothing we are putting out that's new. It was already out there, but I think it got lost along the way.
Definitely, it got lost. So thank you. Thank you both for your expertise and for the work that you're doing. Patrick, how can people find you online? You're everywhere.
Yeah, we have oxygenadvantage.com and buteycoclinic.com, and we have an app as well, which might be useful for some people, Oxygen Advantage,
which is free.
It's all free. Everything inside it is free as well. So yeah.
So yep. It's wonderful, and your book can be found on Amazon and bookstores everywhere. The Breathing for Yoga book. So thank you both so much. It's always a pleasure to talk about breath, and especially these are my two passions, breath and yoga. So they continue to save me from myself every single day.
Well done.
Thank you both.
You could have worse vices, I'm sure.
What'd you say?
You could have worse vices. There's a lot of people down in the pub drinking pints of alcohol, so you have the right solution there.
Oh, that's so funny. Okay, thank you both. See you soon.
Bye.
Thanks, Andy. Bye.